Hi, everyone. Welcome to a special reading group session on Hannah Arendt's essay, Responsibility Under Dictatorship. My name is Samantha Rosehill, and it's really lovely to see everyone's faces right now, to see so many people that I know and who have been students over the years and that I haven't seen in a while, and to see so many new faces as well. We had well over 100 people sign up for this reading group tonight. And when I sent the final reminder to people who signed up today, we had raised $3,425 collectively, the total of which I will be directly donating to the Immigrant Law Center of Minnesota. And I'll send along that confirmation as well, along with the total amount, because we had a couple of people sign up in the last 5 minutes as well, as always happens. So I've tried to get everyone the Zoom link. I will also be sending a video recording of tonight's conversation tomorrow. So for those of you who are listening to this playback, please know that we're grateful that you're with us as well, and thank you. When so most of you, most of you know me. Most of you know that I, for personal reasons, moved to France in January. So I am not physically in the United States right now, and I'll be here for a year or so. And it's been especially difficult watching things unfold in the United States from abroad. And I was talking with a friend of mine um, about what can we do in moments like this. And one thing that I know I can do is teach. So one thing I can do is create space for other people to come together collectively to talk and to have conversations with one another. And so just as an immediate response, that's why I decided to host this special reading group and also to support a good cause to help those who have been taken by ICE in Minnesota. And being in Europe, one does not escape ICE either. Now there are protests across this continent in response to the deployment of ICE to the Olympics in Italy. So that's why I decided to do this. And I chose this essay in particular because I have always found this to be the most direct essay that Hannah Arendt writes politically when confronted with the question of what one can do. And before I turned on recording, I said I gave a bit of a forewarning for those who might not be as familiar with her work that she's not a comfort read. She does not believe in any sort of reckless hope or reckless despair. I always think of her work as firmly planting our feet on the ground and trying to get us to look straight ahead, neither up, hopefully, nor down despairingly, to see reality as it is unfolding in front of us, as it is directly in front of us, so that we can respond to what it is that we are experiencing in this moment now. When she published The Human Condition in 1958, she wrote at the end of the prologue that what she wanted was nothing more for us to stop and think what we're doing from the perspective of our most recent fears, from our most recent experiences. Because for Hannah Arendt, all thinking moves from experience. And it's when that we stop thinking for ourselves and allow other people to think for us or look for answers outside of ourselves or interpretations of events outside of ourselves that we give up our right to free thinking, that we ultimately give up our will to act in a way that we know is morally in line with, I'll say, what is good. So in one way or another, all of her work is about thinking in this sense, trying to get us to face the reality that is unfolding in front of us. And this feels especially prescient to me at a moment when so clearly people say, I saw this happen, and you have voices of authority who say, no, that did not happen. What you saw is not true. What you saw is a lie. It's more important than ever to really trust one's senses of reality, of what they see in front of themselves. So that's why I chose this essay of all essays in the body of Hannah Arendt's work, although there are certainly other essays that are applicable or would resonate in this moment. Before I jump directly into personal responsibility under dictatorship, for those of you who have not studied Hannah Arendt with me in the past, I wanted just to give you a brief overview of her definition of the human condition, which I had the pleasure of teaching the other night for the Jewish Telegraphic Agency. And all political thinkers, or I should say most political thinkers in one way or another, have a definition of what it means to be human. So for someone like Aristotle, he talks about how man is a social animal. For someone like Thomas Hobbes, who was writing during the Civil War in England, he argued that life is nasty, brutish, and short, and therefore we should endeavor peace with one another. For Rousseau, we naturally had a capacity for pity, to feel pity when we saw our fellow human creatures suffering, and we had an inherent instinct to self-protection and survival. And that's what we call often social contract theory and philosophy, which tries to imagine a state of nature before society. So Hannah Arendt, at the core of her work, has her own understanding of what it means fundamentally to be human. And it's something that I come back to time and again in my own thinking as a gentle reminder of certain immutable facts of our collective existence. The first part of her definition of what it means to be human is that we were born on this earth, this planet. And this planet is our home. And we were born on the earth, and we were born into a world that was made. A world that was made by those who came before us, and a world that will continue to exist when we leave. We appeared on earth in the world that we make in common with one another. We all appeared here. None of us asked to appear here, but we appeared here. And we will all disappear from here. And we all appeared here differently from one another. And we reveal our difference and our uniqueness every time we speak and every time we act. We all appeared here. We all have a right to be here. And we're all different from one another. And that's what she called plurality. And every time we act, she says, we set something new into motion, the outcome of which cannot be predicted. So as long as new people are born into this world, into a world that was made by the hands of people, and as long as they act, this world can always be other than it is. Because at the end of the day, it is only us that make the world that we live in. We make the world that we live in. So this is Arendt's fundamental understanding of what it means to be human. And to emphasize the point, because this is where she's going to pick up with the essay Personal Responsibility Under Dictatorship, to emphasize the point, when she ends her book, Eichmann in Jerusalem, a report on the banality of evil, which was her report on the trial of Adolf Eichmann, she argues that he must be put to death. She's not nonviolent, that he must be put to death because he violated this fundamental tenet of the human condition. Simple fact that we all have a right to be here, that we all have a right to exist, and that no person should be targeted because, in this case, they were Jewish, simply because of how they appeared in the world, the whatness of their being. So Hannah Arendt publishes Personal Responsibility Under Dictatorship in 1964. And this essay in particular was inspired by the controversy that was touched off by her reporting on Eichmann in Jerusalem. And there are two things going on in this essay, many of which find their way into her final work, The Life of the Mind. One is that she wants to understand the controversy around her reporting on Eichmann, because for her, she went to the trial, she observed what happened, she shared her experience of that, which is one's factual truth, and she was told, that's not what you saw, you got it wrong, that didn't happen. And so she wanted to understand what that phenomena is. When a person experiences something, says, this is what I saw, this is my impression of it, this is what it meant to me, and somebody says, nope, that didn't happen. This is what happened, this is what it means. You're absolutely wrong. And the other question, she's going to give us some specific questions, which I'll get into, but the other question at the heart of this essay in particular is there a way to prevent evil in the world? Hannah Arendt became a writer by accident. People always ask me where to read the original or what the best translation is, and I have to pause and I have to say, she wrote in English. She wrote her major works in English because she was forced to flee Germany in 1933 and then Europe in 1941. She wrote her work in English, and she became a writer by accident because for her, she is thinking from her experiences as a German Jewish woman in exile, trying to reckon with how it is that Nazism and then Stalinism emerged in the middle of the 20th century. So she wants to know, is it possible somehow to prevent evil in the world? And she doesn't say yes, and she doesn't say no. She says if. If it is possible to prevent evil in the world, then it has to happen somewhere in the thinking process. And so it is a question of personal responsibility, a personal moral responsibility. It's a question of thinking. So toward the beginning of the essay, she offers us a framework, just pausing occasionally to let people in still. She offers us a framework around the trial of Eichmann and the response she received to her writing in order to raise these questions of moral responsibility. And she says, I was told that judging in itself is wrong. No one can judge who had not been there. This, incidentally, was Eichmann's own argument against the court's judgment. When told that there had been alternatives and that he could have escaped his murderous duties, he insisted that these were post-war legends born of hindsight and supported by people who did not know or had forgotten how things had actually been done. So she's putting the question of judgment on the table, the question of judgment and the question of who has the ability to judge. And that question of who has the ability to judge is a moral issue. And she's going to, if you have the essay in front of you, she's going to offer us two questions on the bottom of page 18 and the beginning of page 19. She says, first, how can I tell right from wrong if the majority or my whole environment has prejudged the issuer? Who am I to judge? And second, to what extent, if at all, can we judge past events or occurrences at which we were not present? So for her, she wants to draw a distinction between legal issues and moral issues. And this is important because it directly relates to the question of personal responsibility. Legal issues and moral issues are not the same thing, but they do have an affinity with one another because they're both presuming, they're both presupposing the power of judgment. At the end of The Origins of Totalitarianism, which she published in 1951, she says that the moral order had been turned upside down overnight. Suddenly, the law, thou shalt not kill, became thou shalt kill. And it happened so fast, and people were so used to obeying the law that they didn't even notice that this had happened. And so by prying apart legal questions from moral questions, she's also reminding us that everything the Nazis did was legal. Technically, it was legal. So in order to act in any way, one had to break the law. She writes in another place, one had to become an outlaw. So in the first part of this essay, she's going to talk about the ways in which we as individuals are made to feel uncomfortable when we're confronted with moral judgments. How do we talk about moral judgments? How do we talk about the character of a person? How do we accept moral judgments or challenge moral judgments? And she talks about how the moral judgments that shape a society are not even necessarily readily apparent. They're almost always taken for granted. It's not something that's not I think of it as like a switch that flips on and off. It's something that happens gradually over time. And she says at the time, thinking about her time leading up to in Germany up to 1933, she says at the time, the horror itself and its naked monstrosity seemed not only to me, but to many others to transcend all moral categories and to explode all standards of judgment. It was something men could neither punish adequately nor forgive. And in this speechless horror, I fear we all tended to forget the strictly moral and manageable lessons we had been taught before, and we would be taught again in innumerable discussions, both inside and outside of courtrooms. So she's reflecting on the breakdown of her education in moral questions. After February 27th, 1933, she put down all of her academic work and said that she only wanted to do political work for her people. She said she wanted nothing more to do with the academic milieu. because it turned out that the professional thinkers whose job it had been to think about questions of morality were those people who were least equipped to actually face the reality that was unfolding in front of them at the time. The professional thinkers were the least reliable people because they had created their own kind of web or nest of thoughts that became a kind of ideological barrier to seeing the horror of what was happening. And at the time, she lost many friends. She was criticized for talking about what was happening. And of course, she was also reckoning with what Martin Heidegger had done by joining the Nazi Party. And she says the new regime posed to us then nothing more than a very complex political problem. And one aspect of this was, she says, the intrusion of criminality into the public realm. And this is one of the key elements of totalitarianism that she talks about in the origins of totalitarianism, is the emergence of criminality into the public realm, where the political elite mobilizes what she calls the mob in order to carry out the criminal actions and violence of the state against the citizens, because the elite cannot do it themselves. They need a mob to carry out their violence for them. Moving on, she's going to tie this question together with the question now of personal responsibility, this question of morality with personal responsibility. And she says the moral issue arose only with the phenomenon of coordination. The German word is Gleichschaltung. So you can think about institutions, people going along with, right? And that's really the key phrase, going along with the coordination of institutions. And there's a beautiful note in one of her notebooks, and she writes, why is it, she says, I'm thinking of two quotes. She says, is there a way of thinking that's not tyrannical? And she says, the point is to resist getting swept in the tide at all. And she says, why is it so hard to think? So it's not with fear-inspired hypocrisy, she says, but with this very early eagerness not to miss the train of history. All right, so there's something about the feeling that this is a historical moment, that I am in a historical moment, that I too want to be a part of history. That's one of the reasons people go along with a movement, with an ideological political movement, because it claims to be able to predict history, the flow of history, the future, where things are going. And she says, with this, as it were, honest overnight change of opinion that befell a great majority of public figures in all walks of life and all ramifications of culture, accompanied as it was by an incredible ease with which lifelong friendships were broken and discarded. In brief, what disturbed us was the behavior not of our enemies, but of our friends, who had done nothing to bring the situation about. They were not responsible for the Nazis. They were only impressed by the Nazi success and unable to pit their judgment against the verdict of history as they read it. There's something about a political movement at some point that makes it appear as though it were fated, as though it were a natural part of the unfolding of history, of this is inevitable, this is happening. And part of what she's trying to do is to get us to see that nothing is ever inevitable, nothing. that no one can predict the future, right? And that is something that ideological movements promise people, and it's very seductive. It's very seductive to be promised knowledge of the future, all knowledge of all things. This is why things are the way they are. This is how we're going to fix it. This is how things are going to be. It's also what the sirens offered Odysseus in the Odyssey, and the cost even then was life. She says, without taking it into account, the almost universal breakdown, not of personal responsibility, but of personal judgment in the early stages of the Nazi regime, it is impossible to understand what happened. So personal judgment breaks down first. And just to put that in another way, what she means by that is that people lose the ability to tell right from wrong. Because suddenly what was wrong is now legal. Because moral values change overnight. Because things happen very quickly. And she says the moral disintegration at the time of German society was a dress rehearsal for the total collapse of society. You can kind of think about moral disintegration almost as a kind as a kind of addiction, right? A little bit. It's okay. A little bit more. A little bit more. It's a kind of disintegration that slowly erodes an individual's ability to make judgments for themselves. It introduces an inner cynic, an inner skeptic, and a process of inner questioning that causes one to question their own judgments. And so she wants to understand why there is, she says, so little preparation in this type of moral judgment. And she gives us the example of legal punishment and talks about how legal punishment is justified on social grounds. And she argues that the usual grounds for legal punishment cannot be applied to a war criminal because they were not ordinary criminals, she says. So in moments when one is confronted by crimes that are not ordinary, the usual standards of judgment fall away. And she says, how can you think, and even more important in our context, how can you judge without holding on to preconceived standards, norms, and general rules under which the particular cases and instances can be subsumed? Or to put it differently, what happens to the human faculty of judgment when it is faced with occurrences that spell the breakdown of all customary standards and hence are unprecedented in the sense that they are not foreseen in the general rules, not even as exceptions from such rules. So suddenly when you're confronted with new crimes, with new actions, one wants to reach for the standard concepts that they have for moral judgment. That's murder. That's thievery. We have these concepts and we want to apply them. But when we engage in that thinking gesture, saying, well, this is that, we're delimiting, we're cutting off our ability to see the new in what is happening. I'm reminded of a quote from an interview where she says, to look to the past in order to find analogies for the present day is a mythological error, right? We can think with the past, but we can't use it as a framework. And one of the things that prevents this type of responsibility and thinking and moral judgment that she's talking about here is the impulse that we have, which is very human, to apply standard or normative concepts of judgment to what it is that we are experiencing. But that can change the way that we experience something so that it, I want to say, perhaps does not puncture us in the way that it otherwise might not be. There's something inherently comforting in that human impulse of being able to make something recognizable, of being able to say, this is that. And she's trying to get us to not do that, or to catch ourselves when we do that. She says, we are all burdened by the sins of our fathers, having been born into a world that preceded our existence. And she is going to go to Hamlet to say that anyone who takes upon himself political responsibility must also say, this time is out of joint, O cursed spite, that ever I was born to set it right. So this sense that the time is out of joint. So to set the time right means to renew the world. And this goes back to where I started with her definition of what it means to be human, because what she's saying is that we can all do this, because we all arrived in this world at one time or another as newcomers in a world that preceded our existence and will continue after us. It was here before us and it will be here when we're gone. And that we share, right, the burden of it, and that we leave it to those who will come after us. Think of Bertolt Brecht's poem, to those who come and to those who will follow in our wake, or to those who are born later, on die Nachgeborene. That when humans are able to care for one another again, he asks future generations, please judge us gently. Those of us who want it to be gentle could not be so. But she says, this is not personal responsibility. This is simply part of what it means to be human. And there's actually a danger here. There's a danger here that she wants us to be aware of. She says, where all are guilty, none are guilty. So how can we see what is happening as a reflection of this moment now? And the question is, who's doing the crime? If all people feel guilty, that is somehow an assuagement of the crime in itself, right? Of trying to offset that human burden of existing at a time when terrible things are happening. She says, those who had done nothing admitted how guilty they felt, whereas those who had very much done something showed no remorse at all, like Eichmann. And this creates moral confusion. One cannot feel guilty for something that they have not done. And claiming guilt creates moral confusion. What she's also doing with this is she's trying to put the emphasis on the action itself, on the action itself, on the individuals who carry out the crimes. She says there is no such thing as collective guilt or collective innocence. Guilt and innocence make sense only if they are applied to individuals. And this is the genius of bureaucracy in carrying out different forms of, I was going to say state violence, but it creates a layered system which makes it difficult to hold those directly responsible for the actions accountable for what they have done with their hands. She calls this the cog theory. All the functionaries who perform the roles of the political system. Or I could say there's a reason why government agents wear face masks, right? That in itself is the performance of bureaucracy meant to create a mass of individuals who are carrying out the law, which is legal, right? So the individual is not meant to be held accountable, and their actions, it's not about their individual actions. Arendt says no to this. Individuals must be held accountable for what they do. Bureaucracy becomes a way of escaping accountability politically. And this is a problem in the courtroom when one tries to charge such a criminal according to normative legal standards, as she saw with Eichmann, because he said that he was just doing his job, right? He was following orders. He was a cog in the machine, right? So he wasn't responsible for anything. But in a courtroom, an individual is tried for their crimes. You are charged with for doing X. Bureaucracy is meant to undermine that so no one can be held accountable for the crimes of the state. And Arendt says that the Eichmann trial wouldn't have been interesting to anyone if he had merely been a cog. What made him so interesting was the fact that he was a man, that he was a person, and that's what she had found interesting and a large part of what she was criticized for. So she is going to shift now to the second part of her essay, which is dictatorship, in order to begin to answer the question of personal responsibility under dictatorship. And she is a thinker of distinctions because she's always trying to take apart those built-in inner concepts we use to give meaning to our experiences in the world. And she says totalitarian forms of government and dictatorships in the usual sense are not the same. And she says that she's been talking mostly about totalitarianism. And she says dictatorship in the old Roman sense of the word was devised and has remained an emergency measure of constitutional lawful government, strictly limited in time and power. And she says we still know it well enough as the state of emergency or the martial law proclaimed in disaster areas or in times of war. So a dictator is still operating within a legal structure. And the origins of totalitarianism, there's a nice passage where she says that wannabe totalitarian leaders, who often start out as dictators, use and abuse democratic freedoms in order to abolish them. So one uses the existing legal and democratic political apparatus of the state in order to take it over, in order to use it to abolish the freedoms that it was meant to secure. And she says, we furthermore know modern dictatorships as new forms of government, where either the military seize power, abolish civilian government, and deprive the citizens of their political rights and liberties, or where one party seizes the state apparatus at the expense of all the other parties and hence of all organized political opposition. She says both types spell the end of political freedom, but private life and non-political activity are not necessarily touched by it. The most insidious part about a totalitarian regime, as opposed to a dictatorship, is that a totalitarian regime wants to, say, conquer everything. And the most insidious part of that is that it wants to conquer your mind. It is about conquering the inner life of the individual and reshaping your thinking. All thinking moves from experience. If one's fundamental experience of reality is changed, one's thinking changes. If suddenly one no longer feels free to speak in public, to share an opinion, if one doesn't feel free to walk down the street, if one doesn't feel free to simply go and buy a gallon of milk or some bread, if one is told to report on their colleagues or their neighbors, this fundamentally changes the environment that one inhabits and moves through every day, creating an environment of fear, cynicism, and suspicion, isolating each person against the other, and ultimately the self against the self, so that one can no longer trust their own experiences of reality. Totalitarian regimes want to conquer the inner life of the individual. And the first step, just to go back to the beginning of the essay, is to confuse the sense of right and wrong, to confuse the sense of true and false. It's raining. It's not raining. He had a gun. He didn't have a gun. What is true? What is false? Causing one to question what they see with their own senses. And she says that the crimes of a totalitarian government are concerned people who were innocent, even from the viewpoint of the party in power. It was for this reason of common criminality that most countries signed an agreement after the war not to bestow the status of political refugee upon the culprits who had escaped from Nazi Germany. So totalitarian domination reaches into all spheres of life, not just the political, but the private as well, and to the private inner life of the individual. It's monolithic. Everything becomes subservient to totalitarians' ruling principles and ideology, so that anyone who participates in public life at all becomes implicated in the deeds of the regime. And this is an echo back for her to the end of The Origins of Totalitarianism, where she gives us the concept of radical evil. And some people argue that the banality of evil, which is the judgment she cast against Eichmann, is a rejection of radical evil. I agree with Dick Bernstein. I think they're two separate concepts that work together with one another. And we see both here. Radical evil is the process she's been describing in this essay. So the first step in the process of radical evil is to, she says, kill the juridical person in man, to take away their legal status as a citizen, to challenge their legal status. The second step is the moral murder of an individual, to confuse their ability to judge right from wrong, but also the implication that everyone is now either guilty of murder or murder. And the third is the murder of the individual. What makes a person unique, back to that first principle of the human condition. By trying to fit everything into a framework. And she gives the examples of the prisoners who were sorted at Auschwitz and Birkenau. Citizenship taken, names taken, individuality taken. The banality of evil is the judgment cast against those who carried out radical evil. And it's meant to enforce the point that the people carrying out the evil were just people. They were just people, and it happened on a day like any other day in the ordinary course of human events. Monsters don't rise up out of the sea. There is no radical or grand break in the clock. One wakes up, one goes to sleep. That's what's banal about it. And she says that the crimes were legal within totalitarian regimes. And this poses considerable problems with the question of responsibility. She says, for the simple truth of the matter is that only those who withdrew from public life altogether, who refused political responsibility of any sort, could avoid becoming implicated in crimes. That is, could avoid legal and moral responsibility. So only those who withdrew from public life altogether, who refused political responsibility of every sort. And I think that's the passage that was referenced before we turned on recording. And I will give you the cheat sheet here and say that she says quite clearly that at the time, and she's 1933 is not 2025, right? Neither is 1964. And I think it's important to remember that. But she says that one could either choose to resist and risk being imprisoned and or killed, or one could commit suicide. Right? And she herself had considered suicide when she was in an internment camp in Gurs in the south of France and decided that she loved life too much to give up on it. She says the most difficult thing is to love the world with all of the evil and suffering in it, right? To love it and to choose to be responsible for it. So at the bottom of 35, she's going to begin a conversation about the lesser of two evils, still a very popular political argument. And she says, what do we do when we're confronted with two evils? The argument tells us that we have a duty to opt for the lesser evil, and that it's irresponsible not to choose it all. And she says the reality is that those who choose the lesser evil forget very quickly that they chose evil. Whenever one chooses the lesser evil, one is still choosing evil. And she argues that the acceptance of lesser evils is consciously used politically by governments in order to condition the population to accept evil. Right? That this kind of false dichotomy is part of what leads into that progressive moral collapse, confusing the difference between right and wrong. Well, the lesser evil is better than what is clearly evil, so I'll choose the lesser evil. That's good. But now one has confused what is good and what is bad. Arendt has fantastic sense of humor. I see some people laughing, though it's also not funny. So certainly, but that's what makes it funny. And so she's drawing this distinction between moral and legal standards of judgment. What happens when the legal standards of judgment to participate in a corrupt system complicate the usual standards of moral judgment? When what is legal destroys the moral categories we use. How do we then as individuals decide how to be, how to act in a world where there is evil? And she says, what neither the political reason of state theory nor the legal concept of acts of state foresaw was this complete reversal of legality. In the case of the Hitler regime, she says the whole state machinery enforced what normally are considered criminal activities. There was hardly an act of state which, according to normal standards, was not criminal. Hence, it was no longer the criminal act, which, as an exception to the rule, supposedly served to maintain the rule of the party in power. And now she's going to cut to the moral matter that she is writing about. On page 42, she says, "For the moral point of this matter is never reached by calling what happened by the name of genocide, or by counting the many millions of victims. Extermination of whole peoples had happened before in antiquity, as well as in modern colonization. It had reached only when we realized that this happened within the frame of a legal order, and that the cornerstone of this new law consisted of the command, 'Thou shalt kill not thy enemy, but innocent people who are not even potentially dangerous, and not for any reason of necessity, but on the contrary, even against all military and other utilitarian considerations. The killing program was not meant to become an end, was not meant to come to an end with the last Jew to be found on earth. And it had nothing to do with the war, except that Hitler believed he needed a war as a smokescreen for his non-military killing operations. Those operations themselves were intended to continue on an even more grandiose scale in a time of peace. And these deeds were not committed by outlaws, monsters, or raving sadists, but by the most respectable members of society, respected members of a respectable society." And here she comes now, finally, to the question of personal responsibility. And she is going to give us her answer to this question. She says, "First, in what way were those few different who in all walks of life did not collaborate and refused to participate in public life, though they could not and did not rise in rebellion?" So what sets those who chose not to collaborate consciously apart, even if they could not and did not rise in rebellion? And if we agree that those who did serve on whatever level and in whatever capacity were not simply monsters, what was it that made them behave as they did? On what moral, as distinguished from legal grounds, did they justify their conduct after the defeat of the regime and the breakdown of the new order with its new set of values? To the first question, those who did not participate were the only ones who dared to judge themselves. The difference between people who decided to go along and those who didn't is that the people who did not go along were those who dared to judge themselves. They were capable of doing so not because they disposed of a better system of values or because the old standards of right and wrong were still firmly planted in their minds. Their criterion, I think, was a different one. They asked themselves to what extent they would still be able to live in peace with themselves after having committed certain deeds. And they decided that it would be better to do nothing, not because the world would then be changed for the better, but simply because only on this condition could they go on living with themselves at all. Hence, they also chose to die when they were forced to participate. To put it crudely, they refused to murder, not so much because they still held fast to the command, "Thou shalt not kill," but because they were unwilling to live together with a murderer themselves. And so here in the final pages, the end, we see Arendt come to this question of thinking, of self-reflective thinking and judgment, to engage in what she describes as an internal dialogue between me and myself, where we see the judgment on thinking being rendered to us, and she's turning it around. One doesn't go along in any way because they're afraid of punishment. right? The old moral order has been overturned. It's legal to do that. Being found out, being charged with a crime are not deterrents. So she's trying to find a way to appeal to the inner person, the inner core, the inner moral judge. A person does not go along because it would become impossible to live with themselves. Because their conversation partner in thought for the rest of their lives would be someone who had done evil, would be morally compromised. The dividing line between those who want to think and therefore have to judge by themselves and those who do not strikes across all social and cultural or educational differences. In this respect, the total moral collapse of respectable society during the Hitler regime may teach us that under such circumstances, those who cherish values and hold fast to moral norms and standards are not reliable. We now know that moral norms and standards can be changed overnight, and that all that then will be left is the mere habit of holding fast to something, let's say in thinking. And much more reliable will be the doubters and the skeptics, not because skepticism is good or doubting wholesome, but because they are used to examining things and to making up their own minds. Best of all will be those who know only one thing for certain, that whatever else happens, as long as we live, we shall have to live together with ourselves. And she ends on a question of civil disobedience, asking, what would happen if people disobeyed? No one has the right to obey, she says. There's no such thing as obedience in political and moral matters. We should ask, why did you obey? Not why did you obey, but why did you support, in order to undermine the bureaucratic response of, I was simply doing my job. Not why did you do that, but why did you support that? Why were you in favor of that? Okay, so I am going to pause there. I think I've been talking for precisely an hour, and I want to leave us half an hour for conversation. So she's leaving us with the doubters and with the skeptics and with the imperative that we have to think. We have to stop and think for ourselves from our most recent experiences to judge for ourselves. So I'm going to open it up for a conversation now. And please use the raise hand function. Jim, I see your hand up there. And then Howard.
Question more on online and Aaron's corpus of work. Are you familiar with the Milgram experiments from the early 60s?
Yes, yes.
Yeah, I think those came after Aaron wrote this particular piece.
I don't have the exact year of the Milgram experiments.
Early,
To my mind, this
early,
was published in 64.
early 60s. Is
Mhm.
is this? And I'm just wondering, like I said, is she writing in knowledge of the results of those experiments, or are they two paths that are waiting to cross? And that's all I'm asking. I'm not really
Not
fulfilled.
no, I do not believe she's writing in response to the experiments. No.
Has she ever?
No, I don't believe there's anything that directly is a response to those. No.
Okay. Thank you. Sorry for going into the weeds.
No, that's okay. People have written about Arendt and the Milgram experiments. So, and she might have corresponded with Milgram, but I would have to double check that. Hi, Howard.
Thank you.
Yeah, Pleasure.
I just,
Oops, sorry, Howard. I was trying to do it for you and then I accidentally.
okay.
Okay.
I want to go to the bottom of page 44
Okay.
when Aaron talks about judging. She asserts that, and I'm reading here, that the precondition for this kind of judging is not a highly developed intelligence or sophistication in moral matters, but rather the disposition to live together explicitly with oneself, that inner dialogue. And then a little bit below that, again quoting her, the dividing line between those who want to think and therefore have to judge by themselves and those who do not strikes across all social and cultural or educational differences. I read that as Arendt making a substantial generalization about people. And in thinking about that, I wonder about judgments we might make about the natural variation in individuals' proclivities and capacities. So,
Mm.
first off, proclivities to apprise oneself of facts, facts about the world around us, facts about the situation in which we find ourselves, and then the intellectual capacity to make judgments about those facts. And I don't mean to be crude here, but I don't think that everyone has the same capacity, both proclivity and capacity in that regard. So that when making a judgment about the culpability of individuals, isn't it reasonable to think about potential mitigating factors if one believes that there is that natural variation in both proclivity and particularly in capacity? I think that there is myself. And I think that that generalization, or what I read into that generalization, is too general, too rigid, too demanding.
Mm.
We're all human.
That's certainly true. So, two things. I have a slightly different reading of that passage, but that I don't think changes the response to your core question, which she takes up in the earlier work, The Human Condition. So she says the precondition for this kind of judging is not a highly developed intelligence or sophistication in moral manners. That's classic Arendt tone. That is pure snark. Um, that you don't have to be a genius for this to happen. But what she's really saying is you do not have to be a professional philosopher or thinker in order to judge right from wrong, right? There is nothing exceptional about this capacity to think. And in the thinking book, in The Life of the Mind, she says that, if it is true that the ability to, if it's negative claim to stop evil in some way takes place in the thinking process, then all people are capable of doing it. I'm not sure the cat agrees. She's decided to make appearance and meow if you can hear her. And so it's not about having degrees, right? This is not a question of professional thinking, but it is a question of a person's ability to live together in harmony with themselves. So a person does not commit murder, not because murder is bad or the Bible says thou shalt not kill, or because one will go to prison for the rest of their life. Ultimately, at the end of the day, she argues one chooses not to do murder because that would mean they have to live with a murderer. So they would be damned forever in this lifetime to living with a murderer. knowing what they had done, that they would have to carry around that conversation partner. So for her, thinking is that two-in-one conversation that I have with myself, where the self-consciousness, or the ego, or the I has the ability to engage in conversation with the consciousness, which are those moral values. And so moral values, what's right, what's wrong, what's good, what's bad, are driven into us from the time we are born by the society we live in, the country we live in, the family we're born into, where we grow up. So opening up a space in our own thinking process to become aware of what is guiding our actions is what she's after here. And when we engage in a kind of inner questioning, should I do this? Shouldn't I do this? That is what she calls the process of the will. And it's not harmonious, right? It's a moment of tension. I don't know what'll happen if I do this. I don't know what'll happen if I do that. And one feels that tension inside of themselves. And it's in that moment of deciding, before they've done anything, that they are free. Because once one chooses to act, they have to live with the outcome of the actions. And this is the second part of the question, where she talks about it a bit more explicitly in the human condition. And she reaches for the Christian principle of of punishment and forgiveness, and then reconciliation, to say that there are those who know not what they do. There are those who know not what they do. But and for that, there is a different system of punishment, right? And she's not talking about the sadist. She's not talking about the psychopaths. She is talking about ordinary people who see the laws transformed overnight and choose not to do anything but go along with what is happening. And so why isn't there, if it suddenly becomes legal to start shooting citizens in the street, for example, is that okay now? Right? There's a kind of, she's trying to get us to a place of that inner questioning. What is okay and what is not okay? What justifications are being used? What are the standards of judgment that are being used to defend an argument? And to show how those standards of judgment are meant to confuse our sense of right from wrong, right? To say, this is good. What is happening has to happen. This is good. That becomes part of, because everything has to fit within the ideology of the movement. And so it doesn't matter what's true, and it doesn't matter what's false. All it has to do is support the movement. Dwayne and Mary, I see. Do you want to jump in this conversation?
I'm glad to. Thank you. This follows on your explanation, which already partially answers my question. But just to clarify it a bit more, I do respect and want to highly celebrate Arendt's emphasis on autonomy and basing our morality on a deep, thoughtful process of internal assaying.
Mm.
How can we, or does she, I know she does, but you can clarify this. How can we avoid a charge of solipsism on this? In what manner can we say there is an objective moral code by which we must personally explore our internal life?
Yeah, it's a really beautiful question. And it relates very nicely, I think, to what Howard was asking as well, and gives us another way to think about it. So she's appealing to the Kantian principle. You don't need to know philosophy to know
As
what
I
I'm
thought.
to describe that of inner harmony, right?
Okay.
Of that feeling of harmony within oneself. And I think, we all have had this experience in everyday life. You say something and then afterwards you feel out of joint. I shouldn't have said that. I said the wrong thing. That's not what I meant. And suddenly you're out of harmony with yourself, right? You hear that inner voice come in, or sometimes you do something and you know it's the right thing because there's that feeling of, you know, well, goodness or harmony in that sense. And so here, the tricky part is that the total what she's talking about Hitlerism, she's talking about totalitarianism, that what it tries to do in order to undermine your ability to make that judgment is to confuse true from false, right from wrong.
Mhm.
And so then one can't even make that, I don't know what I'm feeling, right? Maybe that's not what I saw. Okay, so it introduces, she calls it a kind of Thomism, right? A kind of perpetual inner questioning that's meant to undermine your ability to think as that autonomous individual. And so one question would be, how can we open up space for this kind of inner dialogue? I think spaces like this are helpful for it. For her, it's something that you do on your own in solitude,
Mm.
right? Where you think from experience. And, she gives, examples. One example she gives in the essay on civil disobedience is Thoreau, who didn't pay his poll tax to protest the war and slavery, and he spent a night in jail. But he did the right thing. And she talks about Gandhi as another example, and there's for her, and this is politics. She doesn't like representative democracy. She doesn't like representative democracy because she says representative democracy is effectively the outsourcing of our political responsibility.
Hmm.
And she argues for politics at the most local level possible. To really become politically active and engaged, and to understand that real politics takes place at the local level. Right? Shaping the laws, ordinance, curriculum that gives shape to one's community, one's life. And she is, in other words, she tries to understand, why do we want to get rid of this, political responsibility that we have to make our world, right? We outsource it to other people to do it for us. And, there's this kind of assumption that politics carries with it, some kind of baggage that it's not fun work. It's exhausting. It's not joyful. And so she's also, in some of her later work, trying to find a way to put the pleasure and the joy back into politics, into debate, into having open political conversations, to creating spaces in public where people can engage in these kinds of conversations. But at the personal level, she's really trying to get us to think for ourselves, because our thinking is a reflection of who we are. Mary?
Does she speak anywhere about the characteristics of cultures or societies that foster this independence and thinking? And I'm thinking here now about sort of the American focus on being a good team player. And I think that, if your idea is, well, the rest of the team thinks this, I guess I should do it too. And it's tough for kids, for adolescents, for young people to say, nah, I don't think that's right. And I'm going to, stick with my own principles. And that's just a characteristic, I think, of our society in modern America. But there are other societies that don't have that viewpoint. And did she ever talk about that, about the things that foster a people who have that, not just ability, everyone has the ability, I guess, but that encourages people to go in that direction?
Yeah. It's interesting. The thing is, in America, you want to be a team player. I think she talks a bit more about in American, I think there's a difference that Americans have a kind of joiner mentality.
Mm-hmm.
That we like to join groups, we like to join movements, but that is not that does not negate the impulse of American individualism, the attitude of I can do it myself,
Mm-hmm.
as well. And so I think she, across her work, she's more fascinated by what it is about a movement that is appealing to individuals. What is it that makes individuals want to join a political movement? And she talks about that most clearly in Ideology and Terror, and the second conclusion that was added to Origins in 1958, where she talks about how the propaganda functions, how the propaganda of a movement functions, and she ties it. This was a classic post-war argument. She ties it to the collapse of traditional civic, political, and cultural institutions and organizations. So when people don't feel like the traditional political parties represent their interests, then they, where they had historically existed outside of politics, they now enter into politics, because the movement, which says, I don't represent the Republican Party or the Democratic Party, I represent you and your interest. They've left you behind. And so one can appeal to that feeling of having been abandoned by traditional parties or institutions. She argues that people are drawn to political movements because they provide simple solutions to complex social, political, and economic problems. Inflation is bad, you live paycheck to paycheck, you can't get ahead at work, technology is replacing your job. The problem is immigrants who have come from other countries who are taking the work. I have a solution to this problem. I'll get rid of them, and then, everything will be fine, right? You create a narrative, you create a simple solution to a complex problem, and that's very appealing to people. It also offers people the opportunity to become history makers. Join the movement. You too can help make history. What we're doing is historic. And it gives people a way to not think for themselves, which is very appealing, especially in a world where nobody has time to think anyway. One of my favorite statistics is the American Annual Time Use Survey, where I think the average American spends something like 8 hours a day with the television on, another 4 to 6 hours in front of a computer, and they say that they spend about 16 minutes a day thinking, whatever that means. So, if one doesn't have to think about why that something's happening, and somebody can just say, this is why it's happening, that's very attractive to a lot of people. And then the other thing is that a movement tells people that the reality that they've been presented with isn't the true reality. There's actually a true reality behind reality. And by joining the movement, you get the secret to how things actually are, right? You get to see the truth, right? This has all been a scam, right? This is why things are like they are. Let me tell you the truth, right? I'll be your voice, right? So she approaches it from that way. And then to more directly answer your question, the underlying kind of metaphysical human conditions behind all those things, she says, are feelings of rootlessness, feelings of homelessness, and it gets translated as loneliness. It's one of two major essays she wrote in German. But it's really a feeling of abandonment. The German word is Verlassenheit, or it means abandonness. To feel homeless in the world, to feel rootless in the world, and to feel abandoned in the world. And the question that I always come back to, which I think is the question she's really putting before us, is to ask yourself, where do you get your meaning from? Where do you as an individual get your meaning from? And if you can't answer that question, for her, it means one becomes susceptible to propaganda, right? To other people supplying your meaning for you. You don't have to make it yourselves. I have a ready-made home for you. You don't have to think about anything. I've taken care of everything, right? Red flag, red flag, red flag, run, run, run. These things, trying to replace the individual's ability to think for themselves, to undermine them. Paul?
Hey, thank you, Samantha. Fascinating. I am embarrassingly ignorant of Hannah Arendt. I intend to fix that in the spring.
You already are.
Yeah, right. So I'm really interested, and I don't know if she's written about this, and you've sort of touched on it a bit along the way. I'm interested in how a people or a society can sort of realize perhaps they were on the wrong path. And from my accent, you'll gather who I'm talking about. So the changes in Ireland in the last 35 years have been nothing short of amazing compared to the previous 50 or 60 years. And it is remarkable. And so how did she discuss how, obviously, well, the German people perhaps didn't get a chance to think twice about what they were doing. Maybe they wouldn't have, because war came to their door finally. But are there good examples of societies or people who came to a realization that they were maybe on the wrong path? And perhaps we can think about that for the current situation in the US, where I actually live now. Thank you.
That's an interesting question. So there are a couple of examples that come immediately to mind. One is in one of there are 4 different conclusions to the origins of totalitarianism based upon the reprint dates. And in one conclusion, she argues after 1956, she has an essay on, and then she retracts it. Let me preface this by saying she retracts it, that the Hungarian Revolution had been a successful example of the people organizing until she found out what the consequences of that were, and then she changes that. And then she was inspired to write On Revolution, which was published in 1963, the same year as Eichmann, after she saw, I think it was Che Guevara speak at Princeton. And she was also hopeful for the political organization of the people. But what in that book, which is the book, I think that it addresses this, she asks the question of what makes, there's a moment of revolution, and she says even the most radical revolutionary will become a conservative the day after the revolution. And what she means by that is that one has to create institutions. We need institutions in order to govern collective society. And so for her, the question is, how can our political institutions contain that spirit of revolution? And for her, the example was the American Revolution, which was able to create a lasting system 250 years ago this year of the balance of powers, which she was fond of. But even in the 1972, toward the end of her life, when she saw the balance of powers being challenged in the aftermath of the Nixon administration, she said that if something like totalitarianism in the United States were to emerge, it would come from the executive branch. So there are examples that she picks up of countries that are going the wrong way, and then stage a political revolution, but I can't think of one that works out. I think Gandhi in India is the one example of a political movement that she writes about that is successful historically, I would say, off the top of my head. But it's an interesting question. She argues Stalinism is a worse form of Nazism, that had continued to evolve. Yeah. Howard, see did someone else have, I don't know. David, you had your hand up. Did you want to jump in before Howard? Go to Howard.
No. Go ahead, Howard.
Okay, Howard.
Okay, I'm going to be a bit repetitive, so I apologize for that. I'm going to go to the last part of the essay where Arendt, in the context of that trial, talks about the notion of obedience and says, hence the question addressed to those who participated and obeyed orders should never be, why did you obey? But why did you support? So saying fairly directly that obedience is no defense. So in thinking about that a bit more, there was no controversy about the facts and that Eichmann was aware of the facts. He was so intimately involved in what happened there that he was clearly aware of the facts. I suppose that an attorney in that courtroom could try to come up with a line of questioning to try and probe whether Eichmann, aware of certain facts, engaged in something that would be an inner dialogue to see whether he made a considered judgment about those facts, but chose to support. He made a judgment that what was happening was appropriate. But even if we don't reach that particular judgment, we can still say that he is still culpable because he ought to have been aware of the facts and also the significance of those facts. And therefore, she's saying that there's no mitigation there, that even if we judge you didn't consider those facts carefully, maybe you weren't capable of it, but ultimately we can still make a judgment that you are equally culpable. So partly a comment and partly a question for anyone to address.
So she's breaking away from Eichmann here, I think, in the second part of the essay to talk about the difference between people who participated and people who didn't participate. And so to kind of undermine that, to go back to the legal distinction, moral distinction, to undermine the argument of being merely a cog in a bureaucratic machine, she's saying we shouldn't ask those carrying out the orders, why are you obeying? We should ask them, why are you supporting this person? Why are you supporting this movement? What are your personal reasons for supporting this? So it's meant to undermine that bureaucratic attempt at obfuscation to offset responsibility. That's why she's making the semantic argument there. And I think there's she says that in just the final sentence there, if we think these matters through, we might regain some measure of self-confidence and even pride that is regain what former times called the dignity or the honor of man, not perhaps mankind, but the status of being human. So there's something that she's coming back to that question of what it means to be a human being who has to share the world with all the other human beings who are here. And there's that question of personal responsibility and what it means to exist in the world together. Alexander, I want to mark the time in case anyone has to hop off. You get the last question or comment for tonight.
Yeah, thank you.
I-
I'm
It's as
yeah,
late for you as it is for me.
yeah, it is. It's 1:30, and I'm very impressed that you are able to lead a talk in at this time of day.
Disco now.
Yeah. What I want going to say is that I'm a German living in Germany, and I'm very well educated in fascism and all this. And on the other hand, I'm very well aware of what happened in Germany after the war and in the time. And my most important sentence is that in this essay is that if everybody is guilty, nobody is guilty, and this is something that I think we should take care of. And the next step of that is what I'm very aware of happening in Germany in the 70s, in the 80s, in the 90s, that if everybody is guilty, then at some time the people get fed up with that and they ask for not getting accused of something that happened in the past. And in fact, I never heard this argument of somebody who is yeah, somehow very democratic. So there's always an argument to be if it's time that we get the right to be fascist again or to be anti-Semitic again. So it is very important to make people aware that they are acting now, they are guilty now. And so this discussions like these are, I think, very important to have a public awareness.
Yeah.
Hope that makes sense.
No, it does. It does very much. And I think it cuts to the heart of what she's saying in that passage, that if one just accepts that all are guilty, well, we're all alive, right? All these things are happening. We live, we're there. So we're guilty. It actually, that in itself erodes the capacity for moral judgment, right from wrong, because it turns the focus away from the perpetrators, from the individuals who lead a movement, who carry out the actions of the movement, from the individuals. And she's trying to bring us back to action and to get us to ask what we ourselves are responsible for.
Yeah.
Yeah. All right, everyone. Thank you so much for joining me this evening. And thank you for the questions and conversation.
Thank you, Sarah.
Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you very much.
And I always offer someone the last word. If anybody would like the last word tonight, anything they would like to say, I open the floor.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks.
I feel really heartened by the incredible support of this community, and I really appreciate every single one of you. Thank you so much for taking the time to come tonight and to read this essay with me and to think about the question of personal responsibility. To look that I'll go back to Arendt to end and just say that the most difficult thing is to love the world with all the evil and suffering in it. But that's what she called Amor Mundi, and that's the responsibility I think she would have left us with. And looking at our moment for what it is. So thank you, everyone. I hope you enjoy the rest of your day. Have a good evening, and I hope I see you soon.
Thank you.
Thanks. Have a great
Thanks,
evening.
Sam. It was
Night.
great.
Goodbye.